The winter of 1402 arrived in the kingdom of Ashford like a whispered curse, silent, relentless, and bitterly cold. Snow fell in great white sheets over the cobblestone streets of the capital, muffling the sounds of horses and merchants, transforming the ancient city into a realm of muted beauty and frozen stillness. The spires of the royal castle rose against the pewter sky like the fingers of a giant reaching toward heaven, their stone walls draped in banners of crimson and gold that snapped and fluttered in the icy wind. Inside the great hall, however, warmth reigned supreme. 1,000 candles burned in iron chandeliers suspended from the vaulted ceiling, their flames casting dancing shadows across the tapestries that lined the walls. Scenes of hunts and battles, of kings long dead and victories half forgotten. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meat and mulled wine, of perfumed bodies pressed close together, of ambition and desire wrapped in velvet and silk. It was the night of the winter's crown ball, the most anticipated event of the social season, when the nobility of Ashford gathered to celebrate the turning of the year and to see and be seen by those who held the strings of power. Lords and ladies moved across the polished stone floor in elaborate dances, their jewels catching the candlelight, their laughter rising and falling like music beneath the strains of lute and viol that floated down from the minstrel's gallery. Among them stood Count Edmund Blackwood, the most eligible and the most feared bachelor in all the realm. At 32 years of age, he possessed the kind of dark, severe beauty that made women whisper behind their fans and men step aside when he passed. His hair was the color of a raven's wing, swept back from a face carved with the precision of a master sculptor, high cheekbones, a strong jaw, eyes the pale gray of winter storms that seemed to see through every pretense and every lie. He wore black velvet trimmed with silver thread, a sapphire ring on his finger that had belonged to his father and his father's father before him. The Blackwood fortune was legendary. Their lands stretched from the eastern mountains to the western sea, encompassing villages and farms, mines and forests that generated wealth beyond the dreams of lesser men. But it was not merely money that made Edmund Blackwood powerful. It was his position as the king's closest advisor, his reputation for ruthless intelligence, his ability to make or destroy a man's reputation with a single word spoken in the right ear. He stood apart from the dancers, a goblet of wine in his hand, watching the proceedings with an expression of studied boredom that did nothing to diminish the intensity of his gaze. Beside him, Lord Geoffrey Ashworth, a portly man with a red face and a nervous laugh, attempted to engage him in conversation about trade routes and taxation, but Edmund's attention was elsewhere. He was watching the door. Not because he expected anyone in particular. The guest list had been vetted and approved weeks ago, and every face in the hall was known to him. He watched because it was his nature to watch, to observe, to catalog every detail of his surroundings, as a hawk catalogs the movements of mice in a field below. And so he was the first to notice when the great oak doors swung open and she walked in. She was not dressed like the other women, where they wore gowns of silk and brocade, heavy with embroidery and weighted with jewels. She wore a dress of deep forest green velvet, simple in its cut but extraordinary in its effect. It followed the lines of her body like water follows the contours of stone, flowing, natural, inevitable. Her hair, the color of autumn leaves touched by sunset, fell in loose waves over her shoulders, held back from her face by a simple circlet of silver. She wore no jewels save for a single pearl that hung from a delicate chain around her neck, resting in the hollow of her throat like a tear frozen in mid-fall. But it was not her dress or her hair or even her beauty that made the room grow quiet. It was the way she moved, with a grace that seemed borrowed from another world, a confidence that had no right to exist in one so clearly out of place. She walked as if the marble floor had been laid for her feet alone, as if the candles burned brighter to illuminate her path, as if she belonged here more than any lord or lady born to privilege and power. The music faltered. Conversations died mid-sentence. 100 pairs of eyes turned toward the entrance, and 100 mouths formed the same unspoken question. Who is she? Edmund set down his goblet. Who let her in? Lord Ashworth sputtered beside him, his face growing redder still. That's Eleanor Thorne, the tailor's daughter. Her father makes breeches for merchants in the lower quarter. She has no business here, no invitation, no right. I know who she is, Edmund said quietly. And he did. He had seen her once before, 3 months ago, when he had been riding through the market district on his way to inspect a shipment at the harbor. She had been standing outside her father's shop, helping an elderly woman carry a basket of cloth, and something about the way the afternoon light had caught her hair, the way she had laughed at something the old woman said, had made him pull his horse to a stop. He had watched her for a long moment. Too long. Long enough that she had turned and seen him watching, and their eyes had met across the crowded street. He had expected her to look away, to blush, to show some sign of the deference his station demanded. Instead, she had held his gaze with a directness that bordered on insolence, one corner of her mouth lifting in what might have been amusement or challenge or both. Then she had turned away and gone back to her work, as if he were nothing more than another face in the crowd. He had not been able to stop thinking about her since. Now she stood in the middle of the great hall, the focus of every eye, the subject of every whispered speculation. The guards at the door were conferring frantically, clearly uncertain whether to remove her or await instruction from someone with the authority to decide. The nobles nearest to her had drawn back as if her poverty might be contagious, leaving her isolated in a circle of empty space. And still she did not flinch. Still she stood with her chin raised and her shoulders back, meeting the hostile stares with an equanimity that seemed to come not from defiance, but from some deeper, quieter place within herself. Edmund began to walk toward her. The crowd parted before him like water before the prow of a ship, whispers rising in his wake. He could feel the weight of expectation pressing against his back. They wanted him to handle this, to restore the natural order of things, to remind this presumptuous commoner of her place. He was Count Blackwood, after all, the arbiter of social propriety, the enforcer of invisible boundaries. He stopped 3 feet in front of her. Up close, she was even more beautiful than he remembered. Her eyes were the green of new leaves in spring, flecked with gold, and they met his without wavering. Her skin was fair, touched with a faint flush of cold from the winter air outside, and he could see the pulse beating in her throat, just beside that single perfect pearl. "You were not invited," he said. His voice carried through the silent hall, each word precise, each syllable a small, sharp stone. She did not look away. "No," she agreed. "I was not." "Then you know you cannot stay." "I know what others believe I cannot do," she said. "I have found that their beliefs and my capabilities rarely align." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Shock, outrage, reluctant admiration. Edmund felt something twist in his chest, something he refused to name. "This is not a matter of capability," he said, his voice dropping lower, meant for her ears alone. "It is a matter of propriety, of rules that exist for reasons you cannot understand." "I understand them perfectly well," she replied. "They exist to keep people like me from daring to want something more than the life we were born into. They exist because people like you are afraid of what might happen if we forgot to be afraid." The words struck him like a blow, not because they were wrong, but because they were true. And because he had never expected to hear that truth spoken aloud, here, in this place where lies were the common currency. "You need to leave," he said. "Now. Before this becomes something neither of us can walk away from." She studied his face for a long moment, and he had the uncomfortable sensation that she was seeing something beneath his mask of aristocratic indifference, something he had not shown to anyone in years. "As you wish, my lord," she said at last, and there was something in her voice, not defeat exactly, but acceptance of a temporary retreat. "But before I go, may I ask one question?" He should have said no. He should have summoned the guards and had her escorted out immediately. Instead, he heard himself say, "Ask. Do you truly believe that the circumstances of our birth determine our worth? That a soul can be measured by the thread count of the clothes it wears or the coins in its father's purse?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Edmund felt the weight of 100 watching eyes, the pressure of expectations that had been shaping his life since before he could walk. He felt the cold, familiar armor of his position settling around him, the mask of aristocratic superiority that had served him so well for so long. "I believe," he said slowly, "that there are rules to this world, rules that cannot be bent or broken without consequences." "That is not an answer." "It is the only answer I have." She nodded, as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. Then, without another word, she turned and began to walk toward the door. He should have let her go, should have returned to his place by the wall, accepted Lord Ashworth's congratulations on handling the situation with appropriate firmness, and resumed his watch over the glittering, empty spectacle of noble society. Instead, he found himself calling after her. "Wait!" She stopped but did not turn. The hall had gone utterly silent. Even the musicians had ceased to play, their instruments hanging limp in their hands. "Your name," Edmund said. "I would know your name before you go." Now she turned, and there was something in her eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or the first faint flicker of something that might, in time, grow into hope. "Eleanor," she said. "Eleanor Thorne." "Eleanor," he repeated, and the name felt strange on his tongue, like a word from a foreign language he had never been taught to speak. Then the moment broke. The guards stepped forward, their hands on her arms, and they were escorting her toward the door. She went without resistance, without looking back, and the crowd closed behind her like water filling the space left by a stone. Edmund stood in the center of the hall, surrounded by the finest lords and ladies of the realm, and felt more alone than he had ever felt in his life. The music resumed. The dancing continued. The night went on as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something had shifted in the foundations of Edmund Blackwood's carefully constructed world, and he knew, with a certainty that settled in his bones like winter cold, that nothing would ever be quite the same again. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. Stories like this one, tales of courage and connection, of hearts that refuse to stay in their assigned places, are what we live to tell. Subscribe now so you never miss a single chapter of destiny unfolding. 3 days passed, and the snow continued to fall. Edmund stood at the window of his study, watching the white flakes drift past the glass like the ghosts of words never spoken. The fire in the hearth crackled and popped, casting warmth across the room, but he felt cold nonetheless, a chill that had settled into his marrow and refused to leave. He had not slept well since the night of the ball. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, the green of her eyes, the curve of her mouth, the quiet dignity with which she had borne her humiliation. He heard her voice asking questions he had no answers for, challenging assumptions he had never thought to question. "Do you truly believe that the circumstances of our birth determine our worth?" The question haunted him. He had been born to privilege, raised to power, educated in all the arts of rule and warfare and manipulation that his position demanded. From his earliest memories, he had been taught that the social order was not merely a human invention, but a reflection of divine will. That lords were lords and peasants were peasants, because God had ordained it so, and to question that order was to question the very fabric of creation. But lately, no, not lately. Since the moment he had first seen Eleanor Thorne in the market square, since she had looked at him with those green eyes and refused to look away, he had begun to feel the first stirrings of doubt. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he said, not turning from the window. The door opened and he heard the familiar tread of his steward, Marcus Crane, a thin, efficient man who had served the Blackwood family for 30 years. "My lord, you have a visitor." "I am not receiving visitors today." "I informed her of that, my lord. She insisted." Edmund turned. "She?" Marcus's face was carefully neutral, but Edmund had known him long enough to recognize the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated disapproval. "A young woman, my lord. She says her name is Eleanor Thorne. She says you will want to hear what she has to say." Edmund's heart lurched in his chest, a sensation so unfamiliar that it took him a moment to identify it. "Send her in." "My lord, I must advise against— Send her in, Marcus. The steward bowed and withdrew. A moment later, Eleanor appeared in the doorway. She looked different than she had at the ball. Gone was the green velvet dress, replaced by a simple gown of brown wool, practical and plain. Her hair was pulled back from her face, and there were dark circles beneath her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. She looked tired, worried, determined. She looked beautiful. You should not be here, Edmund said. I know. She stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. But I had no choice. There is always a choice. Is there? She moved toward him, stopping at a respectful distance, but close enough that he could see the fine lines of tension around her mouth. Is there always a choice, my lord, for people like me? When the cold comes and the larder is empty, do we have a choice about whether to eat? When the landlord raises the rent, do we have a choice about where to live? When a lord decides that our presence offends him, do we have a choice about whether to be humiliated in front of everyone we might have hoped to impress? Why did you come to the ball? The question had been burning in him for 3 days. You must have known what would happen. You must have known they would never accept you. I came because of my father. Edmund frowned. Your father? He is ill. Her voice cracked slightly on the word, and she paused, collecting herself. A sickness of the lungs. The physician says he has perhaps 6 months to live, perhaps less. He can no longer work, can no longer provide for us. I am sorry for your troubles, Edmund said, and found that he meant it. But I failed to see what this has to do with the ball. Everything. She met his eyes, and he saw tears gathering there, held back by sheer force of will. My father has been a tailor for 40 years. He has made clothes for merchants and tradesmen, for guild masters and minor officials. He has always dreamed of creating something beautiful enough, fine enough to be worn at court. Just once, he said. Just once he wanted to see his work in the great hall of the castle. Understanding began to dawn. The dress you wore, Edmund said slowly. The green velvet. His masterpiece. A single tear escaped, trailing down her cheek, but she did not wipe it away. He worked on it for months, even as the sickness grew worse. He said if he could just finish it, if someone could just wear it to the ball, he could die knowing that his life's work had been worth something. So you wore it yourself. I had no other choice. No lady would commission a gown from a dying tailor in the lower quarter. No invitation would ever come for a merchant's daughter. But I thought— She broke off, shaking her head. I thought perhaps if I could just slip in, if I could just stand in that hall for a few moments, wearing his creation, it would be enough. He would never have to know how I was treated. I would tell him they admired the dress, that they asked about the tailor who had made it, that his work had been appreciated. You were going to lie to a dying man. I was going to give him peace. Her voice was fierce now, defensive. I was going to let him leave this world believing that beauty and skill matter more than birth and breeding. Is that so terrible? Edmund turned away, unable to bear the intensity of her gaze. He walked to his desk, placed his hands on its polished surface, and stared down at the papers scattered there, documents of trade and taxation, the endless bureaucratic machinery of power. Why are you telling me this? He asked. What do you want from me? I want nothing for myself. He heard her move closer, felt the warmth of her presence at his back. But my father, when I returned from the ball, when he saw my face and knew something had gone wrong, he made me tell him everything. He knows now about the humiliation, about the count who demanded I leave, about the laughter that followed me out the door. Edmund closed his eyes. He blames himself, Eleanor continued. He says his pride and his foolish dreams have brought shame upon his daughter. He refuses to eat, refuses to take his medicine. The physician says that if he continues like this, the 6 months he had left will become 6 weeks. And you think I can help? I think you are the only one who can. She moved around the desk until she stood before him, until he had no choice but to open his eyes and look at her. My father does not need money or medicine. He needs to believe that his work matters, that his daughter was not mocked for wearing his masterpiece. He needs to believe that there is still some beauty and justice in this world. You want me to lie to him? I want you to visit him. Her hand reached out, almost touching his arm, then drew back. I want you to tell him that you saw the dress and were impressed by its craftsmanship. I want you to tell him that you treated his daughter with respect and courtesy. It does not need to be true. It only needs to give him peace. Edmund stared at her. In all his years of navigating the treacherous waters of court politics, of negotiating treaties and managing alliances, no one had ever asked anything of him like this. No one had ever come to him not for money or power or influence, but for a simple lie told out of love. Why should I help you? He asked. After what happened at the ball, why would you even want my help? Because I saw your face, she said quietly. When you asked me to leave, when you spoke those cold, proper words, I saw something in your eyes that did not match what you were saying. I saw hesitation. I saw doubt. I saw a man who was following rules he no longer believed in, playing a role he no longer wanted to play. You presume to know me based on a single moment? I presume nothing. I observe. I was taught that a person's true character is revealed not in their words, but in the small, unguarded moments between them. You are not the man you pretend to be, my lord. I am certain of it. Edmund felt something crack inside him. Some wall he had spent years constructing. Some barrier between himself and the world. I will visit your father, he heard himself say. Tomorrow. Tell him to expect me. The relief that flooded her face was like watching the sun break through clouds after a storm. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you, my lord. Edmund, he said. My name is Edmund. She smiled, a real smile, the first he had seen from her, and it transformed her face into something radiant, something he knew he would remember for the rest of his life. Thank you, Edmund, she said. And in that moment, standing in his study with the snow falling outside and the fire crackling in the hearth, Count Edmund Blackwood began to fall in love. The house was smaller than he had expected. Edmund stood on the narrow street in the lower quarter of the city, looking up at the modest timber building that housed Thomas Thorne's tailor shop. The sign above the door was faded but still legible. Thorne and Daughter, Fine Tailoring. Snowflakes settled on his shoulders, melted in his hair, but he did not move. He had never been to this part of the city before. The streets here were narrower, the buildings older, the people who hurried past bundled in worn cloaks and patched boots. The smell was different too. Wood smoke and cooking meat, the organic press of too many bodies in too small a space. It was not unpleasant exactly, but it was foreign, like visiting a country whose customs he did not understand. The door opened, and Eleanor appeared. You came, she said, and there was wonder in her voice, as if she had not quite believed he would keep his word. I said I would. Yes. She stepped back, holding the door open. Please, come in. My father is waiting. The interior of the shop was warm, heated by a fire that burned in a stone hearth at the far end of the room. Bolts of fabric lined the walls, wool and linen, cotton and velvet, in colors ranging from simple browns and grays to rich blues and deep crimsons. A work table dominated the center of the space, covered with scissors and needles, spools of thread and scraps of cloth. And in a chair by the fire, wrapped in blankets despite the warmth, sat Thomas Thorne. He was older than Edmund had expected, his hair white, his face lined with the deep grooves of age and illness. But his eyes were the same green as his daughter's, and they held the same quiet intelligence, the same refusal to look away. So, the old man said, his voice rough but clear, you are the count who threw my daughter out of the ball. Eleanor made a small sound of distress. Father, let him answer. Thomas did not take his eyes from Edmund's face. I want to hear what he has to say for himself. Edmund felt the familiar weight of expectations pressing down on him. But this time, it was different. This was not the pressure of court politics or noble society. This was the simple, direct demand of a father who wanted to understand why his daughter had been hurt. "I did not throw her out," Edmund said carefully. "I asked her to leave." "Is there a difference?" "Perhaps not to you, but to me, yes. There is a difference between cruelty and duty, between what we wish to do and what we believe we must do." Thomas studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Sit down, my lord. My legs are not what they used to be, and it pains my neck to look up at you." Eleanor brought a chair, and Edmund sat, finding himself at eye level with the old tailor. The fire crackled beside them, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell began to toll the hour. "My daughter tells me you have something to say about her dress," Thomas said. "I do." Edmund leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "When she walked into that hall, Master Thorne, every eye in the room turned to look at her. Not because she did not belong, though that was what they told themselves, but because she outshone them all. The ladies in their imported silks, their gowns heavy with gold thread and precious stones, they looked like painted dolls next to your daughter. And it was not merely her beauty, though she is beautiful. It was the dress." Thomas's breath caught. "The dress? I have seen the finest tailoring the continent has to offer. I have worn garments made by masters in Paris and Florence, in Constantinople and Madrid, but I have never seen anything quite like what your daughter wore that night. The way the velvet caught the light, the way it moved with her body, the way it seemed to breathe and flow like a living thing. It was not merely craftsmanship, it was art." Tears were gathering in the old man's eyes now. "You truly mean that?" "I do not say things I do not mean." Edmund reached out and took Thomas's hand, thin, fragile, the skin like paper over bone. "You asked if there is a difference between cruelty and duty. Let me tell you the truth, Master Thorne. The truth is that I asked your daughter to leave because I was afraid." Eleanor stepped forward. "Afraid?" "Afraid of what she represented. Afraid of the questions she raised simply by being there. Afraid that if I looked at her too long, spoke with her too much, I might begin to question everything I had been taught to believe about who deserves to stand in that hall and who does not." He squeezed Thomas's hand gently. "Your daughter did not shame herself that night. She shamed us, all of us who stood in that room and pretended that our birth made us better than people like you." Thomas was weeping openly now, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. I thought I had ruined her. I thought my pride, my foolish dream. Your dream was not foolish. Your pride was not misplaced. You created something beautiful, something true, and your daughter had the courage to share it with a world that was not ready to see it." Edmund released the old man's hand and sat back. "But I give you my word, Master Thorne. The world will see it. I will make sure of it." "How?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Edmund stood, looking down at father and daughter, at the small, warm room filled with fabric and thread and the quiet evidence of a lifetime of honest work. "There is another ball," he said. "The Spring Festival, 3 months from now. It is the largest social event of the year, even grander than the winter's crown. I would like you, Master Thorne, to create a gown for your daughter to wear, and I would like to escort her myself as my guest so that no one will dare question her right to be there." The silence that followed was absolute. "You cannot be serious," Eleanor finally said. "The scandal. Let them talk. Let them whisper and gossip and clutch their pearls in horror. I have spent my entire life worrying about what others think, about maintaining appearances, about following rules that exist for no purpose except to keep people in their places." He looked at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "I am tired, Eleanor. Tired of pretending. Tired of being the man they expect me to be instead of the man I might choose to become." "But why?" Her voice cracked. "Why would you do this for us? We are nothing to you." You are not nothing." He stepped toward her, close enough that he could see the pulse jumping in her throat. "You are the first person in years who has spoken to me honestly, who has looked at me and seen something beyond the title and the wealth and the power. You are the first person who has made me want to be better than I am." Thomas coughed, a wet, rattling sound that made both of them turn. But when they looked at him, he was smiling, a wide, genuine smile that seemed to take years off his face. "Well," the old man said, "it seems I have work to do. 3 months is not long to create a masterpiece." "Father, you're not strong enough." "Nonsense." Thomas waved his hand dismissively. "I was dying because I thought I had nothing left to live for. Now I have a reason. The best reason." He looked at Edmund, and there was a new light in his eyes, hope, gratitude, something that might have been the beginning of respect. "You will take care of her, my lord?" "I will protect her with my life." "Then that is enough." Thomas reached for Eleanor's hand and pressed it between his palms. "My beautiful girl. My brave, foolish, wonderful girl. It seems your story is not over after all. It seems it is just beginning." Eleanor knelt beside her father's chair, resting her head against his shoulder. Edmund watched them, the old man and his daughter, united by love and loss and the fragile thread of hope he had offered them, and felt something shift in his heart. For the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to belong to something greater than himself. If this story is touching something deep inside you, pause right now and leave a comment saying, "Love is the courage to see beyond circumstance." Let me know you're here, that you feel what Eleanor and Edmund are beginning to feel. Spring came slowly to Ashford that year, creeping into the city like a thief afraid of being caught. The snow retreated inch by inch, revealing cobblestones slick with meltwater and gardens beginning to stir with the first green shoots of the season. In the market squares, merchants began to set out their wares again, and the air filled with the sounds and smells of a city shaking off the torpor of winter. In the Blackwood Manor, Edmund stood before a tall mirror in his dressing chamber, adjusting the collar of his doublet while his valet fussed over the fall of his cloak. The spring festival was 3 days away, and the household had been in a state of barely controlled chaos for weeks. Servants polishing silver, cooks planning elaborate menus, messengers running back and forth with invitations and responses. But Edmund's mind was not on the preparations. His mind, as it had been for the past 3 months, was on Eleanor. He had visited her father's shop twice a week since that first encounter, ostensibly to check on the progress of the dress, but really to spend time in Eleanor's company. They had talked for hours, about books and philosophy, about politics and art, about their childhoods and their dreams and the vast, seemingly insurmountable gulf between their worlds. He had discovered that she was clever and quick-witted, that she had taught herself to read from borrowed books and had opinions on everything from the nature of justice to the proper way to brew chamomile tea. And she had discovered, well, he was not entirely sure what she had discovered. But he had seen the way her eyes softened when she looked at him, the way her hand lingered when their fingers touched. He had heard the catch in her breath when he entered the room, the warmth in her voice when she spoke his name. He was falling in love with her. Perhaps he had already fallen. "My lord." Edmund turned to find Marcus standing in the doorway, his face even more carefully neutral than usual. "What is it?" "You have a visitor, Lady Catherine Ashworth." Edmund felt a familiar heaviness settle in his chest. Lady Catherine was Lord Geoffrey's sister, a beautiful, ambitious woman who had made no secret of her desire to become the next Countess of Blackwood. She was exactly the kind of match his position demanded: noble blood, substantial dowry, impeccable connections. 6 months ago, he had considered her the most likely candidate for his hand. 6 months ago felt like another lifetime. "Show her to the solar," he said. "I will be down presently." Lady Catherine was standing by the window when he entered, her golden hair arranged in elaborate curls, her gown of pale blue silk highlighting the perfection of her figure. She turned at the sound of his footsteps, and her smile was practiced, precise, the smile of a woman who knew her worth and intended to collect on it. "Edmund," she said, extending her hand for him to kiss. "It has been too long." "Lady Catherine." He pressed his lips briefly to her knuckles, then released her hand and stepped back. To what do I owe the pleasure? Can a lady not visit an old friend without requiring a reason? She can, but you are not that lady. Her smile flickered but did not fade. Very well, I shall be direct. There are rumors circulating through the court, Edmund. Rumors that concern me greatly. Rumors are the currency of court life. I pay them little attention. Then perhaps you should pay more. She moved closer, her voice dropping to a confidential murmur. They say you have been spending time in the lower quarter. They say you have been visiting a tailor's shop, speaking with a common girl, behaving in ways unbecoming of your station. And if I have? Then I would remind you of your responsibilities. You are Count Blackwood Edmund, the king's advisor, the head of one of the oldest and most respected families in the realm. You cannot afford to be seen cavorting with peasants. Cavorting. The word tasted bitter on his tongue. Is that what they call it when a man chooses to associate with people outside his own social stratum? They call it scandal. They call it ruin. Lady Catherine's eyes hardened. I know what you're planning, Edmund. You intend to bring that girl to the spring festival. You intend to parade her before the entire court like some sort of exotic trophy. I intend to escort a guest to a public celebration. I was not aware that required permission. It requires judgment. It requires sense. It requires an understanding of the consequences your actions will have, not just for you, but for everyone connected to you. She stepped closer still, close enough that he could smell her perfume, heavy and sweet. Think, Edmund. Think about what you are throwing away. Your reputation, your position, your future. My future? With me. Her hand came up to rest on his chest, her fingers spreading over his heart. We were meant for each other, Edmund. Everyone knows it. Our families have been allied for generations. Our children would unite two great houses, would secure our influence for centuries to come. All you have to do is forget this foolish infatuation with a girl who can offer you nothing. Edmund looked down at her hand, at the rings glittering on her fingers, at the pale perfection of her skin. He thought about everything she represented: safety, tradition, the well-worn path that generations of Blackwoods had walked before him. Then he thought about Eleanor, about the way she looked at him without calculation or agenda, about the sound of her laughter, free and genuine, about the feel of her hand in his, warm and real and alive. He stepped back, removing himself from Lady Catherine's touch. I appreciate your concern, he said, his voice level. But my choices are my own to make, and I have made them. Her face went pale, then red. You are making a mistake, Edmund. A terrible mistake. When this girl's novelty wears off, when you realize what you have sacrificed for her, you will come crawling back to me. And I may not be there waiting. Then I suppose that is a risk I will have to take. She stared at him for a long moment, her eyes blazing with anger and wounded pride. Then, without another word, she turned and swept out of the room, her silk skirts rustling against the stone floor. Edmund stood alone in the solar, listening to the echo of her footsteps fade away, and felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. He had made his choice. He had declared his intentions. There was no going back now. But as he turned to gaze out the window at the spring sunshine falling on the awakening city, he could not shake the feeling that Lady Catherine's visit had been more than just a warning. It had been a threat. The dress was nearly finished. Eleanor stood in the center of her father's workshop, arms extended, while Thomas circled around her with pins in his mouth and a critical eye. The gown was even more magnificent than the green velvet she had worn to the winter's crown ball, a creation of deep midnight blue silk that seemed to hold the stars within its folds. Silver thread traced delicate patterns across the bodice, and tiny crystals had been sewn into the skirt, so that when she moved, she seemed to trail light behind her like a comet crossing the night sky. The hem needs to come up 1/2 inch on the left, Thomas muttered, kneeling with difficulty to make an adjustment. And the sleeves. No, the sleeves are perfect. Leave the sleeves. Father, you've been working for hours. You need to rest. I'll rest when it's finished. He looked up at her, and despite his pallor, Despite the tremor in his hands, his eyes were bright with purpose. My beautiful girl. Do you know how long I have waited for this? For someone to see what I can truly create? Edmund sees it. He says, Edmund. Thomas's voice softened on the name. That young man. He is not what I expected. What did you expect? Cruelty, arrogance, the casual contempt of a man born to power. Thomas sat back on his heels, wincing at the stiffness in his joints. Instead, I found kindness, respect, a willingness to learn and to change. He reached up and took Eleanor's hand. He loves you, you know. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. He has never said... He doesn't need to say it. I see it in the way he looks at you, the way he listens when you speak, the way he lights up when you enter the room, like a candle suddenly given flame. Thomas smiled. I was young once, my dear. I know what love looks like. Even if it's true, Eleanor said quietly, even if he does love me, what kind of life could we have together? He is a count. I am a tailor's daughter. The world will never accept us. The world will accept whatever it is taught to accept. Thomas rose slowly to his feet, steadying himself against the work table. When I was young, people believed that only nobles could read, that only priests could interpret the scriptures, that only kings could make laws. But times change. Beliefs change. All it takes is someone brave enough to challenge what everyone else takes for granted. And you think I am brave enough? I think you are braver than you know. He cupped her face in his hands, his rough palms warm against her cheeks. When you walked into that ball, wearing my dress, knowing what they would think of you, knowing how they would treat you, that took courage, Eleanor. More courage than most people summon in their entire lives. I did it for you. I know. And now I am asking you to do something for yourself. He released her face and stepped back, gesturing at the midnight blue gown that surrounded her like a piece of the evening sky. When you walk into that ballroom, I want you to walk in knowing that you belong there. Not because of your birth or your blood or the coins in your purse, but because of who you are. Because of the beauty and strength and wisdom that you carry inside you. Eleanor blinked back tears. Father. No. He held up a hand. No tears. Tears will stain the silk. But he was smiling, and there were tears in his own eyes, and she knew that this moment, this quiet moment in a small workshop filled with fabric and thread, was one she would remember for the rest of her life. A knock at the door interrupted them. Eleanor turned, expecting Edmund. He had promised to visit that afternoon to see the finished dress. But when the door opened, it was not Edmund who stood on the threshold. It was Lady Catherine Ashworth. She stood framed in the doorway like a portrait of aristocratic disapproval, her golden hair gleaming, her silk gown immaculate, her expression one of barely concealed contempt. Behind her, 2 men in servants' livery waited with the patient stillness of those accustomed to obeying without question. So, Lady Catherine said, her voice dripping with disdain. This is the famous tailor's shop. How quaint. Eleanor felt her father stiffen beside her, but she placed a hand on his arm, steadying him. Lady Catherine, I did not expect... Of course you didn't. People like you never expect people like me to take notice of them. That is, after all, the natural order of things. She stepped into the workshop, her eyes roving over the bolts of fabric, the work table, the simple furnishings. My, is this where the magic happens? Where humble cloth is transformed into gowns fit for countesses? What do you want? Eleanor's voice was steady, but her heart was pounding. I want to make you an offer. Lady Catherine turned to face her, and there was something cold and calculating in her eyes. An offer I think you will find difficult to refuse. I'm listening. You are planning to attend the spring festival as Count Blackwood's guest. You are planning to parade yourself before the court, to make a spectacle of yourself and him, to drag one of the oldest names in the kingdom through the mud of your common origins. Lady Catherine's smile was thin and sharp as a blade. I am here to offer you an alternative. She reached into the folds of her gown and produced a small leather pouch, heavy with the unmistakable weight of gold. 500 gold sovereigns, she said. More money than your father has earned in his entire life. Enough to pay for physicians, medicines, a comfortable house in the countryside where he can live out his remaining days in peace. She held out the pouch. All you have to do is refuse Edmund's invitation. All you have to do is disappear. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Eleanor stared at the pouch, at the promised fortune it contained. She thought about her father's illness, about the mounting bills from the apothecary, about the cold, dark nights when she had lain awake wondering how she would provide for him when her own small earnings were exhausted. She thought about Edmund, about the way he smiled, about the sound of his voice, about the future that might be possible if she was brave enough to reach for it. No, she said. Lady Catherine's eyes widened. I beg your pardon? No. Eleanor straightened her spine, lifted her chin, met the noblewoman's gaze without flinching. I will not be bought. I will not be bribed. And I will not disappear simply because my presence inconveniences you. You foolish girl. Lady Catherine's voice turned venomous. Do you have any idea what I could do to you? What I could do to your father, to this pathetic little shop, to everyone you have ever cared about? I imagine you could do quite a lot. Eleanor's voice was calm, but inside she was trembling. But I have learned something in the past few months, Lady Catherine. I have learned that the only power you have over me is the power I give you, and I choose not to give you any. Lady Catherine's face contorted with rage. For a moment, Eleanor thought she might strike her, might raise her hand and slap her across the face. Consequences be damned. But then the noblewoman seemed to collect herself, smoothing her features back into a mask of cold composure. Very well, she said. You have made your choice. Now you will live with the consequences. She turned and swept out of the shop, her servants trailing behind her like shadows. The door slammed shut, and Eleanor was left standing in the middle of the room, her father's hand gripping hers, the midnight blue dress glittering around her like armor. That, Thomas said quietly, was either the bravest thing I have ever seen or the most foolish. Perhaps both, Eleanor replied, and for the first time since Lady Catherine had walked through the door, she smiled. The night before the spring festival, Edmund could not sleep. He stood at the window of his bedchamber, watching the moon rise over the city, its silver light turning the rooftops to pewter and the streets to ribbons of shadow. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow he would walk into the great hall of the castle with Eleanor on his arm, and the world would know that Count Edmund Blackwood had made his choice. He was not afraid of the scandal. He was not afraid of the whispers, the pointed looks, the turned backs and cold shoulders that would surely follow. He had spent his entire life surrounded by people who valued appearance over substance, who measured a man's worth by the weight of his purse and the length of his pedigree. If those people chose to shun him because he dared to love a woman of common birth, then their company was not worth having. What he feared was hurting Eleanor. He had seen the toll this past week had taken on her. Lady Catherine's visit to the tailor's shop had been only the beginning. Since then, there had been other incidents. A cartload of fabric, accidentally overturned in the street outside the shop, a group of young nobles who had happened to pass by and shout insults at the windows, a letter left on the doorstep containing threats too vile to repeat. Someone was trying to intimidate her. Someone was trying to break her spirit before the ball could even take place. But Eleanor had not broken. Every time he visited her, she greeted him with the same quiet strength, the same determined smile. She refused to discuss the incidents, refused to let him see how much they affected her. She was protecting him, he realized, protecting him from the full knowledge of what his love was costing her. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Enter, he said, not turning from the window. My lord. It was Marcus, his voice unusually hesitant. There is someone here to see you. He says it's urgent. At this hour? I'm afraid so, my lord. He says it concerns Miss Thorne. Edmund turned. Send him in, immediately. The man who entered was young, perhaps 20, with the rough hands and plain clothes of a craftsman. His face was pale, his eyes wide with something that looked like fear. "My lord," he said, bowing clumsily. "Forgive me for disturbing you. I'm Robert Fletcher. I'm an apprentice at the goldsmith's shop, 3 doors down from the Thorns. What has happened?" "There was a fire, my lord. Someone set fire to the tailor's shop. They were inside. Mr. Thorne and Miss Eleanor. They were inside when it started." Edmund felt the blood drain from his face. "Are they—" "Alive, my lord. They got out. But Mr. Thorne—" He breathed in a lot of smoke. "The physician says—" Robert's voice broke. "The physician says he may not survive the night." Edmund was already moving, grabbing his cloak from the hook by the door, calling for his horse to be saddled. The words, "may not survive the night," echoed in his head like the tolling of a funeral bell. He rode through the dark streets at a gallop, heedless of the hour, heedless of the startled cries of the few people still abroad at this late time. The lower quarters seemed to take forever to reach, and when he finally turned onto the narrow street where the tailor's shop stood, he saw the crowd first. Neighbors gathered in clusters, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of torches. The shop itself was a ruin. The front wall had collapsed and smoke still rose from the charred timbers. The smell of burning cloth and wood hung in the air like a shroud. And there, sitting on a low wall across the street, wrapped in a borrowed cloak, was Eleanor. She looked up when she heard his horse approaching, and even in the dim light, he could see the tears that had carved tracks through the soot on her cheeks. He dismounted before the horse had fully stopped, crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides, and gathered her into his arms. "Edmund," she whispered against his chest. "Edmund, I'm so sorry. The dress is gone. It's all gone." "I don't care about the dress." He held her tighter, pressing his lips to the top of her head. "I care about you. I care about your father. Where is he?" "The apothecary's." Her voice was barely audible. "They carried him there. The physician says, 'Take me to him.'" The apothecary's shop was small and cramped, filled with the pungent smells of herbs and medicines. Thomas lay on a narrow cot in the back room, his face gray, his breathing shallow and labored. A middle-aged man in a physician's robes looked up when they entered, his expression grave. "He's stable for now," the physician said. "But the smoke damaged his lungs severely. Combined with his existing illness, I'm afraid there's little more I can do." "Leave us," Edmund said. The physician hesitated, then nodded and withdrew. Edmund knelt beside the cot, taking Thomas's hand in his. "Master Thorne," he said softly. "Thomas, can you hear me?" The old man's eyes fluttered open. They were clouded with pain, but there was still recognition there, still a spark of the fierce intelligence Edmund had come to respect. "Edmund," Thomas whispered, "is Eleanor? She's here. She's safe." Edmund squeezed his hand. "And so are you. You're going to be fine. Don't lie to a dying man." But there was a ghost of a smile on Thomas's cracked lips. "The ball is tomorrow. She won't have a dress. The dress doesn't matter. It matters to me." Thomas's hand tightened on Edmund's with surprising strength. It was supposed to be my gift to her, my way of showing the world what she's worth. Without it, she will still be the same woman she has always been. The dress didn't make her remarkable, Thomas. She made the dress remarkable." Edmund leaned closer. "And I promise you, I swear to you on my life, that she will walk into that ballroom tomorrow. She will hold her head high, and everyone there will see what I see when I look at her. Not a tailor's daughter, not a common girl above her station, but a woman of extraordinary courage and grace." Thomas's eyes filled with tears. "You love her. More than I knew it was possible to love anyone. Then take care of her." The old man's grip was weakening, his breaths becoming shallower. "Promise me." "I promise." Thomas smiled. A real smile, full and warm despite everything. She always said there was good in you, that underneath all that aristocratic nonsense, there was a man worth knowing. He coughed weakly. I'm glad I got to meet him. Rest now, Edmund said. Save your strength. Rest. Thomas closed his eyes. Yes, I think I will rest now. His breathing slowed, steadied, settled into the deep rhythm of sleep. Edmund remained kneeling beside the cot, holding the old man's hand, until Eleanor entered the room and knelt beside him. He's sleeping, Edmund said. I know. She leaned her head against his shoulder. Thank you for being here. There's nowhere else I would be. They sat together in the dim light of the apothecary's shop, surrounded by the smells of herbs and medicines, listening to the quiet breathing of a dying man who had created beauty out of nothing and taught his daughter to do the same. And Edmund made himself a promise, not just to Thomas but to Eleanor, and to himself. No matter what it cost, no matter what he had to sacrifice, he would give them both the future they deserved. Morning came gray and cold, the sky heavy with clouds that seemed to press down on the city like a weight. Edmund had not slept at all. He had spent the night at the apothecary's, dozing fitfully in a chair beside Thomas's cot, waking at every change in the old man's breathing. But as dawn broke, so did Edmund's resolve. He left Eleanor watching over her father and rode back to the Blackwood Manor at a gallop. Marcus met him at the door, his face carefully neutral despite the state of his master's appearance, soot-stained, rumpled, with dark circles under his eyes. My lord, the preparations for tonight? Cancel them. I beg your pardon? Cancel everything. The carriage, the escort, the entire plan. We're doing something different. Edmund strode into the manor, already issuing orders. I need you to gather the household staff. Everyone. I want them assembled in the great hall within the hour. My lord, what? And send someone to the Tailors' Guild. Tell them Count Blackwood requests an immediate audience with their master craftsman. Tell them it's a matter of utmost urgency. By noon, the great hall of Blackwood Manor was transformed into a makeshift workshop. A dozen of the finest tailors in the city had answered Edmund's summons, drawn by curiosity and the promise of a commission from one of the wealthiest men in the realm. They stood in clusters around bolts of fabric that Edmund had purchased that very morning. Silks and velvets in every color of the rainbow, thread of gold and silver, crystals and pearls and precious gems. I need a dress, Edmund told them. A gown worthy of a queen, and I need it finished by sunset. The master tailors exchanged glances. My lord, one of them said carefully, what you're asking is impossible. A gown of that quality takes weeks to create, sometimes months. To finish one in a single day... I don't care what's possible, Edmund interrupted. I care about what's necessary, and what's necessary is that Eleanor Thorne walks into the spring festival tonight wearing a dress that puts every noble woman in the realm to shame. But my lord, there is a dying man across the city, Edmund said, his voice low and fierce. A man who spent his entire life creating beauty, who poured his heart and soul into a single masterpiece, only to watch it burn. His daughter was supposed to wear that dress tonight. She was supposed to show the world what he was capable of creating. He looked around the room at the assembled craftsmen. I cannot give him back what he lost, but I can give him this, the knowledge that his dream did not die with that dress, that his daughter will walk into that ballroom wearing something beautiful, that his life's work inspired others to create beauty of their own. Silence fell over the hall. The tailors looked at each other, at the bolts of fabric, at the determined face of the young count who was asking them to do the impossible. Then the oldest among them, a white-haired man with gnarled hands and keen eyes, stepped forward. Thomas Thorne taught me, he said quietly. When I was young, just starting out, with more ambition than skill. He took me into his shop and showed me how to cut a seam, how to choose a fabric, how to see the garment hidden inside the cloth. He looked at Edmund. If there is anything I can do for him now, anything at all, I will do it. One by one, the other tailors nodded. They moved toward the tables, began examining the fabrics, started to argue among themselves about cuts and colors and styles. And Edmund, watching them, felt something loosen in his chest, something that had been wound tight since the moment he learned of the fire. Hope. The afternoon passed in a blur of activity. Edmund moved between the workshop in his hall and the apothecary's shop where Eleanor sat vigil, carrying news of progress and words of encouragement. Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid, sometimes lost in fever dreams, but always asking the same question. Is the dress finished? Will she be beautiful? She will be, Edmund promised him. She will be the most beautiful woman in the kingdom. As the sun began to set, painting the clouds in shades of rose and gold, a messenger arrived at the apothecary's shop. It's done, my lord. The dress is finished. Edmund brought Eleanor back to the manor, led her through the halls to a private chamber where the gown waited. When she saw it, she stopped in the doorway, her hand flying to her mouth. It was not the midnight blue of her father's destroyed creation. It was gold, gold like sunrise, gold like candlelight, gold like hope made visible. The bodice was embroidered with flowers in thread of every color, a garden blooming across her heart. The skirt fell in flowing waves that caught the light and scattered it like seeds, and tiny jewels had been sewn into the fabric so that when she moved, she seemed to carry a constellation with her. The tailors, Edmund said quietly. Each of them contributed something. The embroidery is from Master Harrison. He said your father taught him that stitch 30 years ago. The jewels are from Master Chen, arranged in a pattern your father invented when he was young. Every thread, every bead, every fold of this dress carries a piece of his legacy. Eleanor reached out with trembling fingers to touch the fabric. Tears were streaming down her face, but she was smiling, really smiling, for the first time since the fire. It's beautiful, she whispered. You're beautiful. Edmund took her hands in his. The dress is just fabric and thread. You are what makes it extraordinary. She looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw everything. Gratitude and love and fear and hope, all mixed together into something he could not name, but knew he would spend the rest of his life trying to understand. Edmund, she said, whatever happens tonight, whatever they say, whatever they do, I want you to know that this is the happiest I have ever been. Because of you. Because you saw something in me that no one else could see. I saw the truth, he said. I saw who you really are. And there, in the fading light of a spring evening, with the golden dress gleaming between them like a promise, Count Edmund Blackwood bent his head and kissed Eleanor Thorne for the first time. The great hall of the royal castle blazed with light. 1,000 candles burned in their chandeliers, supplemented tonight by torches placed along the walls, so that the entire space seemed to glow like the inside of a lantern. The finest lords and ladies of Ashford had gathered once again, dressed in their most elaborate finery, their jewels flashing, their laughter echoing off the vaulted ceiling. But as the hour grew late, and the dancing grew more vigorous, a restless whisper began to circulate through the crowd. Where was Count Blackwood? Where was the tailor's daughter? Lady Catherine Ashworth stood near the dais where the king and queen sat observing the festivities, her face a mask of satisfaction. She had heard about the fire, of course. Everyone had heard about the fire, though no one spoke of it openly. The tailor's shop destroyed, the old man on his deathbed, the dress reduced to ashes. There would be no scandal tonight, no commoner parading herself before the court. Edmund would be humiliated, of course. His absence would be noted, his apparent cowardice mocked. But that was a small price to pay. A few months of shame, and then he would come back to her, chastened, ready to accept the match that had always been his destiny. Lady Catherine smiled and raised her goblet to her lips. The doors to the great hall swung open. At first, no one noticed. The music continued, the dancers whirled, the conversations buzzed on. But then the people nearest the entrance fell silent, and that silence spread like ripples in a pond until the entire hall had gone still, and every eye had turned toward the doorway. Count Edmund Blackwood stood on the threshold, dressed in black velvet trimmed with gold. His dark hair was swept back from his face, his gray eyes calm and steady, his expression one of quiet confidence. And on his arm, her hand resting lightly on his sleeve, stood Eleanor Thorne. The golden dress caught the candlelight and threw it back in 1,000 directions, so that she seemed to glow from within, like a star descended to earth. Her autumn hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders, held back by a circlet of flowers that matched the embroidery on her bodice. She held her head high, her green eyes surveying the assembled nobility without fear or shame. She was, without question, the most beautiful woman in the room. For a long moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The silence stretched on, thick with shock and disbelief, and something else, something that might have been wonder. Then Edmund stepped forward, leading Eleanor into the hall, and the crowd parted before them like the Red Sea parting before Moses. He walked slowly, deliberately, giving everyone time to look, to see, to understand what was happening. This was not an accident. This was not a mistake. This was a declaration. They reached the center of the hall, directly before the royal dais. Edmund stopped, turned to face the king and queen, and bowed low. Eleanor curtsied, the golden skirts of her gown spreading around her like the petals of a flower. King Robert leaned forward on his throne, his brow furrowed. He was an old man, white-bearded and shrewd, and he had seen many things in his long reign. But this was new. "Count Blackwood," the king said, his voice carrying through the silent hall. "You bring an unusual guest to our celebration. I bring the woman I intend to marry, Your Majesty." Edmund's voice was clear and strong. "If she will have me." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Eleanor's hand tightened on Edmund's arm. "Marry?" The king's eyebrows rose. "A count of your standing, married to a common girl?" "With respect, Your Majesty, there is nothing common about Eleanor Thorne." Edmund turned to face the assembled nobles, raising his voice so that everyone could hear. "This woman's father is Thomas Thorne, a master tailor who has spent his life creating beauty from nothing. His work has clothed merchants and tradesmen, guild masters and officials, and yes, even some of you standing in this hall, though you would never admit to wearing garments made by a man of the lower quarter." He paused, letting that sink in. "Last night, someone set fire to Master Thorne's shop. His life's work was destroyed. His masterpiece, the dress Eleanor was meant to wear tonight, was reduced to ashes. And Master Thorne himself lies even now in an apothecary's shop, fighting for his life." Murmurs ran through the crowd. Some faces showed shock, others, guilt, a few, satisfaction poorly disguised. "But the men who tried to destroy Eleanor Thorne did not succeed," Edmund continued. "Because the tailors of this city, the craftsmen whom we so often overlook and dismiss, came together to create something new. The dress Eleanor wears tonight was made in a single day by a dozen master tailors, each of whom contributed their skill and their labor as a tribute to Thomas Thorne and his legacy." He turned to face the king once more. "Your Majesty, you asked if I truly intend to marry a common girl, and I tell you yes, I intend to marry Eleanor Thorne. Not despite her birth, but because of who she is, a woman of courage and grace, of intelligence and compassion, who has taught me more about honor and dignity in 3 months than I learned in 30 years of noble society." The hall had gone absolutely silent. Not a cough, not a whisper, not a rustle of silk or clink of jewel disturbed the stillness. King Robert studied Edmund for a long moment. Then, slowly, his weathered face broke into a smile. "I have known you since you were a boy, Edmund Blackwood," the king said. "I knew your father, and his father before him. And in all that time, I have never heard you speak with such passion, such conviction." He rose from his throne, descending the steps of the dais with careful dignity. "It seems to me that this young woman has accomplished something remarkable. She has taught one of the proudest men in my kingdom how to be humble." He stopped in front of Eleanor, who stood frozen, her face pale, her eyes wide. "Miss Thorne," the king said, "it is not often that a commoner walks into my hall and captures the heart of one of my most valued advisors. It is even less often that she does so with such grace and dignity. He reached out and took her hand, raising it to his lips. I welcome you to my court, and I give my blessing to your marriage, should you choose to accept this stubborn fool's proposal. Eleanor's breath caught. She looked at Edmund, at the king, at the sea of faces surrounding them, some hostile, some shocked, but many, she realized, showing something that looked almost like approval. Your Majesty, she said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart, I am deeply honored by your blessing, but before I answer Count Blackwood's proposal, there is something I must know. She turned to Edmund, and her green eyes searched his face. Do you truly love me? She asked. Not the idea of me, not the symbol of rebellion that I represent, but me, Eleanor Thorne, daughter of a dying tailor, a woman with no fortune, no connections, nothing to offer you but herself. Edmund smiled, a real smile, warm and unguarded, the smile of a man who has finally found what he was looking for. I love you, he said simply. I love your courage and your kindness. I love the way you laugh and the way you think and the way you refuse to be anyone other than who you are. I love you, Eleanor, and I will spend the rest of my life proving it to you if you will let me. Tears were streaming down her face now, but she was smiling too, smiling so brightly that she seemed to outshine even the golden dress. Then yes, she said. Yes, I will marry you. Edmund pulled her into his arms and kissed her, there in the center of the great hall, before the king and queen and all the assembled nobility of Ashford. And this time, when the silence broke, it broke into applause, scattered at first, then growing, swelling, until the entire hall rang with it. Even Lady Catherine, standing pale and rigid by the dais, could not stop the tide of approval that was sweeping through the room. The music started again, a waltz, slow and romantic. Edmund took Eleanor's hand and led her onto the dance floor. I don't know the steps, she whispered. Neither do I, he admitted. I've been dancing them my whole life, but I never really learned them until now. And as they moved together, spinning slowly in the candlelight, wrapped in music and gold and the glow of a love that had conquered everything, birth and breeding, scandal and fire, the cruelty of those who would have kept them apart. Eleanor Thorne looked around the great hall and realized something extraordinary. Everyone had stopped dancing, not out of shock this time, not out of horror or disbelief. They had stopped because they were watching her and Edmund, watching this impossible love story unfold before their eyes, watching two people who had dared to believe that who you are matters more than where you come from. And in the watching, something changed. Not everything. Not all at once. The world did not transform overnight, and there would still be whispers and rumors and cold shoulders to endure. But something shifted that night in the great hall of Ashford Castle. Something small and fragile and incredibly precious, a seed planted in soil that had long been barren. The seed of hope. The garden was in full bloom. Eleanor sat on a stone bench beneath an arbor heavy with roses, a book open in her lap but unread. Her attention was elsewhere, on the two figures walking toward her across the manicured lawn, silhouetted against the afternoon sun. Edmund walked slowly, his arms supporting the frail figure beside him. Thomas Thorne moved with the careful deliberation of a man who knows his body is failing, but refuses to give in to it. He had survived that terrible night a year ago, against all odds and all predictions. Survived, he liked to say, because he was too stubborn to die before seeing his daughter married. He had seen that and more. He had stood in the chapel of Blackwood Manor, supported by Edmund on one side and his old apprentice on the other, and watched as Eleanor became Countess Blackwood. He had danced, or tried to dance, at the wedding celebration, shuffling in a slow circle while Eleanor laughed and cried and held him close. He had moved into a sunny room in the manor, where he spent his days teaching embroidery to the household servants and telling stories to anyone who would listen, and he had met his grandchild. "Mother!" A small voice rang out across the garden, and Eleanor looked up to see a toddler running toward her on unsteady legs, her auburn hair flying behind her, her green eyes bright with excitement. "Mother, look! Grandfather showed me how to make a flower!" The little girl thrust her hand toward Eleanor, revealing a crumpled piece of fabric clumsily shaped into something that might, with generous interpretation, be called a rose. "It's beautiful, Rose," Eleanor said, pulling her daughter into her lap. "Did you thank Grandfather for teaching you?" "Thank you, Grandfather," Rose shouted across the garden, waving at Thomas, who had settled onto a bench at the edge of the lawn. "You're welcome, little one," Thomas called back, his voice thin but warm. "Next time, I'll show you how to make a butterfly." Edmund reached Eleanor's side and sat down beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, watching Rose toddle off to chase a butterfly across the grass. "She has your eyes," Edmund said, "and your stubbornness. I prefer to call it determination." Eleanor laughed and leaned her head against his shoulder. "However you name it, she comes by it honestly, from both sides." A year had passed since the spring festival, and the world had changed more than Eleanor could have imagined. The scandal of their marriage had eventually died down, replaced by newer, more interesting gossip. Lady Catherine had retreated to her family's country estate and had not been seen at court since. And slowly, gradually, the rigid boundaries of Ashford society had begun to soften, not disappearing entirely, perhaps never disappearing entirely, but bending in ways they never had before. A merchant's son had been granted a minor title for services to the crown. A guildmaster's daughter had married the younger son of a baron, and in 100 small ways, in drawing rooms and marketplaces, in casual conversations and formal debates, people had begun to question the old certainties about blood and birth and worth. Change was coming to Ashford. Slow change, imperfect change, but change nonetheless. And it had started here, in this garden, with a dying tailor and his courageous daughter and a count who had dared to love across the boundaries his world had built. "Edmund," Eleanor said softly. "Yes?" "Thank you." He turned to look at her, his gray eyes soft with love. "For what?" "For everything." She reached up and touched his face, tracing the line of his jaw, the curve of his lips. "For seeing me when no one else would. For standing beside me when it would have been so much easier to walk away. For giving my father a reason to live, and my daughter a world where she might be judged by who she is, rather than where she came from." "You gave me those things," Edmund said. "All I did was open my eyes." "Then thank you for opening your eyes." He pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Always." Across the garden, Thomas was teaching Rose to count the petals on a flower. His voice was weak and his hands trembled, but his face was alight with joy. This was his legacy. Not the dresses he had made or the skills he had taught, but this. A family built on love instead of rank. A home where beauty and kindness mattered more than blood. Eleanor watched them and felt her heart overflow with gratitude. A year ago, she had been a tailor's daughter with nothing to her name but courage and a green velvet dress. She had walked into a ballroom where she didn't belong, been humiliated by a man who couldn't see past her birth, and left believing that her dreams were as dead as the winter snow. But dreams, she had learned, were more resilient than she had imagined. They could be scorned and dismissed, burned to ashes and left for dead, and still they would rise. Transformed, perhaps, but undefeated.